Fix your pillows. Pull that blanket higher. We're going back to the high country 1834 where the only law is weather and the only judge is winter. Your eyes open to a darkness that feels like it has weight. Not the comfortable kind you know from a city bedroom with street glow sliding through the blinds. This dark eats light. Frost has turned your wool blankets stiff as bark, and the boughs under your back have printed a pattern of needles into your muscles. Somewhere in what maps will someday call Montana, the air tastes like iron and snow. A storm is on the way, not the pretty postcard kind. The kind the old hands say decides who gets a spring. You've got 12 hours. That's the rumor among trappers. Once a storm shows real teeth, a man has half a sun to raise walls enough to live behind. Fail, and you freeze slow, first your fingers, then your courage, then your plans. You won't die in a chase or a duel. You'll die in bed, which is to say, on the ground. You bring the fire back from embers with cedar bark you've nursed dry inside your shirt, the way men do when their life depends on a coal. Your possibles bag flint and steel, a bone needle, a pinch of salt, the last hard strips of venison jerky rests where your hand can find it without your eyes. Your rifle leans against the nearest pine, your axe hand-forged in St. Louis. Haft smooth by months of sweat is sunk in a stump like a promise. You picked this clearing for reasons that don't exist back. East, south facing, slope for warmth. A spring that steams on the coldest mornings. Pines thick to the north to break the wind. High ground with a long view because neighbors up here might be a grizzly fresh from a berry patch or a raiding party with ghosts painted across their faces. Pick wrong and you don't get a do-over. The mountains remember mistakes. Breakfast is jerky and cornmeal boiled in your tin cup until it stops crunching. It tastes like a boot smells, but it warms you. You don't eat for pleasure in the mountains. You eat to become wood and sinew, a machine for chopping. You shoulder your axe and walk the edge of the clearing. You spent yesterday marking lodgepole, pine straight grain, little taper, 12 to 14 inches through, the kind that stack tight without arguing. A mountain man once told a soldier turned journalist, pick logs like a woman you'd bet a life on true, tough and steady when the wind hollers. The line got printed back east and turned into a joke. Out here, it's gospel. You talk to the first tree like the old-timers taught you quietly, with your ears open. Every trunk carries its own history. Branches that dragged more weight on. One side, a twist hidden in the grain. Last night's wind loading snow on the wrong face. You sight your undercut toward the lay you want the gap between two saplings, and start a notch big enough to look like a door in a church. Chips fly. The first dozen swings wake your shoulders. The next 100 numb them. You're not chopping a tree. You're buying hours to keep your blood moving in January. The hinge moans. When you step to the back cut just a hair higher you feel snow riding the wind. Little stinging specks on your cheek. You don't look up. You keep your eyes where the stump meets the steel. Cutting careless is how men lose thumbs. And losing a thumb out here is like losing a horse. Mathematically interesting, but practically fatal. The top sways. The pitch squeals. Back, back. You hear your own voice say it's only you hear, but it steadies your feet. The pine gives up to gravity and thunder crashes a century into the earth. Birds sprint out of the sky like a shaken quilt. Resin sweetens the air. You lay your palm on the fallen bark the way you always do and say thanks without words. 1 down, 20 to go. You limb fast little branches flicking off with quick, wristy cuts, big ones demanding measured bites. The trunk turns clean and pale as a bone. By mid-morning, blood from a popped blister slicks your grip. You don't stop to bind it. The cold will do that for you. You down to more trees, drag them with a grunt and a curse to the clearing, and square them side by side. Your breath hangs over them like laundry. Then the mountains test your patience. On the fourth tree, your axe sings a note you don't like. Loose and the head sails off the haft into the snow like a black bird. The sound your chest makes isn't a word. You do not have a second axe. You do not have a store. You have 20 minutes of daylight for every job that takes you an hour. You drop to your knees, sweep the powder with your bare hands until your skin burns white. And there she is, half buried, dull with frost, waiting for you like a friend who didn't leave when the luck went bad. You rasp the wood of the haft with your knife, wedge, wrap wet rawhide, and hold the joint near the little fire until the hide shrinks like a fist. A fix like this will hold, but not forever. You'll test the head every dozen swings and feel like you're counting heartbeats. You learn quickly out here. If it breaks, you're alone with the consequences. The sky grays into steel by noon. Snow feathers the pines. That storm isn't bluffing. You strip bark, you hew faces. You mark the first 4 wall logs with charcoalton by 12 feet inside, big enough to sleep and breathe, small enough to heat. You notch ends with parallel cuts and pop the waist with the heel of the blade, carving a saddle that will cradle. The next log, it's not pretty. Pretty comes later or never. Tight is what keeps you alive. You lay the first rectangle, the foundation of everything you'll do here. Your stomach asks for payment you don't have time to give. You shove more. Jerky in and drink spring water so cold it hurts your teeth. You start the ramp. Saplings and brush stacked into a slope. Snow tamped into ice. A path for rolling weight you can't shoulder alone. The first lift of a second log almost kills you. Halfway up, the thing surges backward like it remembered. It's a tree and not your servant. You leap aside and it crushes your ramp into a mess. You taste copper and hear the blood in your ears. You breathe slow and rebuild, rougher and lower, with a rope of rawhide and a prayer that's mostly a promise to keep trying. You heave and inch the weight until the notch kisses the notch. The sound it makes, a hollow thud that says we belong, stirs something in your chest you don't think about unless you have to. You didn't just lift wood. You lifted tomorrow. The light falls off a cliff. Snow turns from whisper to sentence. You get one more log, set one more line against the dark hand. Then you cede the sky to the storm. You kick your fire into a roar. Dry your gloves over it until they steam, and stake your little camp beneath a leaning bough. You eat, you drink. You slide the axe under your blanket where a soft man would keep a book. Your last thought before the wind's voice puts you down is a math problem. 4 logs in, too high, 12 hours left. Tomorrow the walls must rise. Or you won't. Back east, breakfast dishes, clink and coal smoke climbs brick chimneys. Here, the only arithmetic that matters is wood, time, and heat. The mountains do not grade on a curve. Asterisk, you wake to the way deep cold makes silence. A muffled, heavy quiet that eats sound and gives you your own breath back in clouds. Your beard has frozen to your blanket. When you peel free, it takes whiskers with it and humor you don't have. The fire is a red eye under ash. You whisper it awake and pay attention to the way your fingers move slow, clumsy, a warning. You shove your hands under your shirt and press them to your belly until your nerves Start sending mail again. Snow fell on you in the night, like an argument you couldn't win. 3 inches on everything. More coming, if the sharpness of the sky has any say. Your plan from the dirt sketches yesterday is still there under the heel prints and melted holes, a charcoal rectangle that means shelter. This morning, the plan grows teeth, walls to shoulder height before sundown. Leave a gap in the east wall for a fireplace. Build smarter so you don't die stronger. You debark 3 logs while your breath writes. Ghost words you don't bother to read. Every strip of bark you peel, you save the roof, will want it. Pine bark laid like shingles will shed snow and pity. You mark and chop saddle notches, cleaner than yesterday. Your hands remember the angle now. Your cuts start sounding like a metronome, instead of a bar fight. By mid-morning, you're a steady choreography. Roll, heave, notch, test, set. The logs climb to your chest. You pause long enough to drink slush and sharpen steel. An axe that doesn't catch is a lie you can't afford. The storm darkens to the color of a bruise, and the air goes spitinal cold. You fling a curse at the wind, and it brings it back to you twice as loud. Fine, you lean in. Work as heat. The 4th lift of the day. The ramp gives a little shudder that says, not today, and the log you're courting decides to dance. It rolls, hesitates on the edge, then commits to wiping you off the earth. You throw your shoulder and your whole stubbornness under it, and lever against a sapling you jammed where it could matter. 2 inches, 4 a foot. Your back sings news. You'll feel in 20 years, if you get 20 years, and then the log settles like an animal finding straw, and the wall is 4 high. All right, you say to nobody, because nobody is also you, but nobody answers in a human voice. Not at first. The crunch is soft at the edge. Of hearing a rhythm you know because you made it yesterday with your own feet, a man's step in snow. Your hand finds the rifle without looking, you listen. The wind hisses. Snow ticks the bark roof you haven't built yet. Then the voice. Hello, the camp coming friendly. 2 shapes slide out of the trees like they grew there. Buckskins patched to hell. Rifles kept cleaner than their faces. One is long and stringy, beard to the belly and eyes that carry laughter like a knife carries shine. The other is square, as a stove, shoulders built to move logs and mules. They stop where a careful man would stop, far enough not to spook you, close enough to read your hands. Name's Fitzgerald, the tall one says. He nods toward the second. Cooper, you. Don't lower the rifle, you lower your shoulders. Coffee, you say, jerking your chin at the fire. They come in slow, the way men do when the last bad thing that surprised them was claws. Coffee is a generous word for what you make when you've boiled the same grounds 3 times. But hot is hot, and courtesy is coin. The 3 of you squat by the heat and talk around what you won't say. Their eyes, like yours, measure everything. Your woodpile, your stacked logs, the sharpness on your axe, the way you hold your shoulders when the wind whistles. Men find out who they are by watching each other work, not by swapping names. Fitzgerald stands and pushes his hat back. You set your first course true, he says, towing the base logs. But your notches can be better. He picks up your axe like a preacher picks up a Bible and shows, not tells. Instead of square grooves, he arcs the cut, a shallow bowl that welcomes the next log and locks against the wind. Saddle notch, he says, hugs tight, tight is warm. Cooper has already walked the perimeter of your little empire like he's a fence looking for a way in. Horse, he asks, Down below, you say, which is to say, gone since August. He grunts like he already knew and shrugs off his pack. Then we'll lift. You don't ask why. Up here, reasons are a luxury. The rule is older than coin. Today, me. Tomorrow, you. Maybe they saw your smoke and remembered a winter when somebody answered theirs. Maybe they like coffee as much as survival. Maybe they're just hungry for a voice that isn't a wolf's. The day becomes a new machine when there are 3 men to turn the gears. Cooper cuts, setting a steady beat with his axe that you learn to hear more than watch. You debark and rough notch quick, dirty, effective. Fitzgerald moves along the line like a master of a craft that only exists out here, shaving, rounding, testing fits with his palm and his ear. He talks little. When he talks, it's a sentence you can use right now. Leave that gap, he says. At the east wall, you'll want a fire to pull smoke. You cut after, you'll hate yourself twice. Ridge beam, he says later, pointing to a pine that's as long as your ego used to be. We'll need her up there. Best we can do today is set it. Rafters tomorrow if the sky don't punish us. By noon, the walls are 5 logs high and your blood is alive. The storm pushes fine needles of snow into the seams of your coat, but the walls push back and the wind has to respect the line you're drawing. When you stop to drink, Fitzgerald watches the trees and says, "Hear that? Snow on a load means the top is heavy. Take your back cut lower." You don't argue, you just learn. Cooper builds a deadman buries a stout log crosswise in the snow, packs it hard, rigs a rawhide rope over the top like he's anchoring a boat. He grins at your raised eyebrow. "Lever," he says, and a promise. The ridge beam is a bully with no sense of humor. Together you heave and the rope sings and the deadman holds and the beam walks up the wall like she meant to live up. They're all her life. When it finally slides into its seat and you feel the whole frame take a deep breath, Fitzgerald laughs like a coyote stole a chicken and got away clean. "There," he says. "Now she looks like a house, not a stack of chores." Light is falling fast and the snow is committing to its bit. Big flakes you can read the sky through. You pitch rafters a few, enough to make a skeleton. Your hands stop bleeding because there's no blood left to spare for theatrics. Cooper kicks a shallow pit into the dirt inside the new walls and nurses a fire into being. Smoke gathers under the rafters and swirls like it wants to stay. Tomorrow, Fitzgerald says, we give her a throat. He means a fireplace. He means a way for smoke to go where it's asked, not where it pleases. The 3 of you eat like wolves' jerky for you. A little parched corn from Fitzgerald, a treasure of dried venison Cooper keeps like a secret and shares like grace. The fire throws light up the rough logs and paints shadows that look like company. You feel a feeling you haven't let yourself feel for months. Not safety, that's not real here, but not alone. It's different. It helps first winter. Fitzgerald asks finally. You nod. You picked smart. Cooper says to the rafters. Water, slope, pine to the north. Coming from a man with hands like sled runners, it's a benediction. Wind scours the walls and finds less purchase than it did this morning. The ridge beam creaks a new language, the sound of wood learning work. Fitzgerald empties his cup, sets it upside down like a tombstone, and uses his hat as a pillow. Cooper rolls into his blanket on the other side of the fire. You put your back to the new wall, your rifle within reach, and tell your pulse to calm. Down or leave when sleep takes you. It's not a surrender. It's a deal. You keep the fire, we keep you. Tonight. The mountains accept those terms. Asterisk morning comes dripping through the gaps like thin gold. The storm hasn't finished. It's learned rhythm. Snow eases and then hammers, rests and then reminds. Your roof bones hold what they can. Where they don't, cold fingers find your face and wake you with a wet poke. You laugh, once short, and mad at the same time, and kick the fire to life. Roof first, Fitzgerald says, standing and stretching that long frame until he's the height of the room. Then her throat. You say, though you know, chimney, he nods. A house without a way to breathe smokes like a liar, kills as slow. You haul saplings for Perlin's little cross pieces Cooper calls stringers, because he worked one summer on the Mississippi with men who nailed words to everything. You lash them to rafters with rawhide that smells like every camp you've ever wished you weren't in. Fitzgerald begins peeling bark off the big, clean lengths. You felled long sheets that come away if you work the edge right and keep the cold from cracking them. Bark won't keep weather out forever, but it buys nights by life. You build a ladder out of ambition and 2 straight poles and a joke Cooper makes about your weight and then swallows because he doesn't do jokes often. Fitzgerald climbs like he spent his life walking on timber. Pass, he says, and you and Cooper pass bark sheets up like giant, wet shingles. They lay them bottom to top, like scales, like the cabin is a fish trying to slip free of the storm. Where bark splits, he stuffs it with moss and needles, talking under his breath to the roof like he talks to horses. You can't hear the words. You recognize the tone when half the roof is covered. The cabin feels different. The light changes, the sound changes, your spine changes. The idea of inside becomes a fact. Cooper points at the east gap you left on Fitzgerald's orders and says, rocks. The creek below talks under ice. Along its banks, stones wait like the bones of the country. You pick the flattest, heaviest ones because a fire will teach a stone a new job. Hold heat without cracking from the surprise. You roll them up the slope with numb hands and curses that steamed our mortar. The ground is a drumhead of frost. You hack at it until you find a little honest dirt and melt snow in your pot. Cooper adds shredded fibers, pine needles, dried grass you dug from under a stump to give the mud some muscle. Clay would be better, he says. But clay is a wish, and we ain't got a wishing store. Fitzgerald from the roof sings down progress like a river captain calling depth. 3 courses, 4, she's tight on the north edge. You grin in spite of yourself. The house is turning from plan into memory. Cooper lays the hearthstones like they matter. They do, if the back wall of the firebox leans wrong. Smoke pouts into your room and stays. If the throat is too wide, heat leaves like a man who owes money. Too narrow, and creosote builds like a sin and bites you with flame in your sleep. Let the back wall lean over the fire just a little, Cooper says, setting a flat stone with his gloves off so his fingers can feel what his eyes can't. Makes heat come out instead of go up. You're good at learning when you're hungry. You hold the next stone, and he nods once. The kind of nod that buys a man 2 degrees warmer in February. By midday, the roof is skinned in bark and laced with moss, and the fireplace's mouth stands, waist high, teeth of stone ready to eat winter and smile. The chimney climbs, narrowing as it goes. Outside, Cooper builds a little walkway of poles leaned against the wall so he can keep stacking stones without breaking his neck. On a day like this, the difference between a platform and a mistake is a boot width. You hand up mud, Fitzgerald ties a door together from split planks and rawhide hinges, then carves a latch from a shed antler you kept because it felt like a story. It clicks into place with a carved wooden peg, and suddenly the line between in and out is something you can command. Moment, Cooper says, as the chimney breaks above the roofline. He caps it with flattest rocks he's found, a rough hat to keep the worst of the snow from dropping straight in. He slides to the ground with the sour, satisfied look of a man who has argued with gravity all morning and won enough to sit. You lay a fire in the new hearth, the way your hands learned from nights in the open. Twist of bark, pencil sticks, thumbsticks, a split chunk crosswise to catch the flame's ambition. You light with patience, not speed. The flame takes and walks up the sticks. The sticks talk to the log decides it's ready. Smoke billows into the room. First new chimneys cough, they don't sing. Then, like a story remembering its best part, the draw starts. The smoke stands up. The throat eats it. The air clears. Heat rolls into your face in a shape you recognize from childhood kitchens and campfires both. There she goes, Fitzgerald says, and a man who has seen 3 too many winters and buried. 1 friend too many allows himself. A smile that makes him look 30 and not a day more. You don't know you're holding your breath until you let it go. Cooper pulls a gift from his pack. 2 snowshoe hares he snared at dawn. He skins with 4 strokes and a twist, like the mountain taught him to be efficient or die slow. The meat goes on green sticks over the new hearth, and fat drips on hot stone with a sound like rain in June. You don't blink while you wait. You humble yourself and sip the grease with your fingers, and don't let shame touch you. Men in towns can have manners. Men here have needs. While the meat turns brown and noble, you look around your new room and count changes the way a soldier counts. Scars for walls that stop the wind from coming all the way in. A roof that catches snow instead of dumping it in your lap. A door that tells wolves and weather both to ask permission. A fireplace that gives smoke a road and heat a job. Fitzgerald pinches. Tobacco from a pouch offers, and you take a pinch because it's salt in a world that tastes like metal. Cooper stares at flame like it owes him rent, and then remembers a story about the Green River rendezvous that features a mule, 2 gallons of whiskey, and a man named Quince who still owes him $1. You laugh, reel, and it hurts something in you in a good way. Why help? You ask, finally. Because the question sits in the cabin with you like a 4th man and wants to be acknowledged. You didn't have to. Fitzgerald wipes a hand on his knee, leaving a crescent of ash. Mountain law, he says, simple. You don't need it when you don't need it. When you do, you better find out you already paid. Cooper nods without looking. A man alone is meat with a pocket, he says. 3 men are trouble for the cold. You eat. You do not speak for a while, because eating is a sacrament and deserves silence. When you're done, you lick your fingers and hate yourself a little for being an animal, and then forgive yourself because you're alive. Snow hunts the cracks. You're chinking a mixture of mud and Moscows into those cracks with your fingers because you don't own a trowel, and because your fingers will tell you where the wind wants to live. You smear and stuff until the cabin's sigh changes. Not warm, not yet, but not bleeding heat like it did. You listen. Houses have voices. This one is learning to whisper. Tomorrow, Fitzgerald says, counting tasks with his thumb. We finish the roof where it sifts. We lay a floor, or at least joists. You sleep off the earth and live longer. We build a bunk so your bones are not snow. Shelves, Cooper adds. A man without shelves steps on his life at night. would you say, seeing the pile you have as what it is, a joke winter will laugh at before swallowing, will need more than a priest needs words. Aye, Fitzgerald says, and better walls yet. The mountains are patient. They'll wait until the day after you think you're ready. Night comes proper, not a grey fading, but a lid. You feed the fire like it's a living thing you love, small, steady, consistent. Greed with fire is how men wake up to nothing but black wood and regret. The smoke goes where it should, most of it. The room glows orange and makes your hands look like someone else's older. Cracked, competent. Sleep feels different inside. It's still a blade on your throat, to wake to add wood, or the blade does its job, but the edge isn't pressed. As hard, you hear wolves salt the valley with their song, and your heart answers with a beat that says, not tonight. You close your eyes and the house holds you, the way a boat holds men too far from shore to swim, right before you go under. You think of a word you haven't let yourself think since August, spring. You don't say it out loud. You don't dare. But you think it, and the thought doesn't burn your tongue. The mountains hear everything. Tonight, they decide not to punish you for hope. Asterisk, you wake to the kind of quiet that feels like glass brittle, gleaming, and one breath away from breaking. The storm has staggered off, and the world outside your door is a single, unbroken sheet of white. It has flattened the clearing and shouldered everything down to the same level the stumps. The brush, even the deer tracks have been erased. The only thing left standing with shape is your cabin and the black seam of the creek where it sawed the snow open and kept a thin vein of moving water alive. Inside. The fire you banked last night is a nervous red eye under ash, squinting. You get your hands moving slow, careful puffs of your breath into the cedar shavings, twig, thumbstick, then the hand-hewn split that catches and decides to live. Smoke rises, tilts, and the throat you and Cooper built yesterday takes it up. Like a promise kept, a trickle of warmth reaches your cheeks. Your beard has frost rime clinging to it like salt. Fitzgerald rolls out of his blanket without a word, crouches by the hearth, and warms his hands the way old men pray, palms forward, eyes on a glow only he can see. Cooper stomps to life in 2 steps and says, "Floor today." He doesn't say it loud. He doesn't need to. You can feel it through your boots. The earth is drinking your heat like a drunk who thinks the bottle is bottomless. The ground is the enemy. That truth takes some men a winter to learneth. They get a winter to learn it at all. You clear space. Heave your joist logs from the corner where you stacked them, and lay them across the room to study their run long enough to span from sill to sill, straight enough that they won't warp like a lyre come February. Fitzgerald kneels, taps the lower wall logs with a knuckle, and marks where the joists should seat, 2 feet apart. Give or take, tighter where the sleeping platform will live. You cut too deep. You weaken the wall, he says. Too shallow and the joist'll rock like a cradle. He carves a shallow V with the tip of his knife where each notch should begin. Little tick marks that feel like lines under a sentence. You set to cutting the first pocket with your axe. It's not a felling swing, it's a mason's tap. You bite shallow, beveling the pocket, shaving a clean little bed that invites a joist to lie down. The axe sings a different tune when it's used, rightless scream, more hum. The grain answers you with a change in vibration when you're close. To depth, you stop, fit the first joist, too high on the west side. You take 3 controlled bites and feel the joist drop a 1/4 inch and settle. The sound it makes is addictive, a solid thunk with a quiet of its own afterward. Like the cabin is satisfied. Cooper's already scoring the next notch with a tomahawk he uses like a tiny adze, his motions fast and neat. We'll hew the tops flat, he says, or your planks will rock underfoot and break an ankle the first time you jump awake at a noise. He smiles without mirth, and you will. You work in a rhythm that turns an hour into a blink and a lifetime at the same time. Mark, chop, test, shave, seat. The joists lay down one by one, 5, across the room, then 7, then 9. Each gets its top flattened with shallow, patient strokes your axe set at a skimming angle, popping thin curls that pile around your boots like a fiddler's shavings. The feeling in your hands is more feedback than force. The tool tells you when the plane is true. The sound tells you when you're pulling across a high spot or a stubborn knot. By mid-morning, the room has agreed a skeleton, chest wide, that bridges. Winter, you feel warmer standing on joists than you did on the dirt. It's not your imagination. Air trapped beneath would act like a thin blanket. The floor won't suck the heat out of your bones like bare ground. You thumb sweat from your eyebrow and it freezes on your glove in one breath. Planks, Fitzgerald says, we'll rive them green. They'll shrink later. When they do, you'll curse and rechink and say my name rude. But today you'll thank me because you won't be sleeping in mud. You shoulder a straight lodgepole about 15 inches through and roll it against a pair of rounds that serve as sawbucks. Cooper sets a wedge in the end grain with 3 clean strokes of his axe pole and drives it. The log complains in a long, resonant groan that vibrates in your hips. The split runs true for a foot, hesitates at a knot, then leaps forward as Cooper adds a second wedge and you feed a slender hardwood glut to spread the seam. The log breaks with a sigh. Inside, the wood is pale as bone and smells like bright. Pitch. You and Cooper work it down. Halves 2 quarters. Quarters 2/8. Every time a split threatens to wander into a spiral, Cooper corrects with a wedge driven where grain winks the wrong way. Follow the grain, he says. Don't fight it. Fighting wood is like fighting a river. You'll get wet and embarrassed. By noon, you have a stack of rough slabs with one face that looks like an animal tore it, and the other face that could be coaxed into flattish with care. Lunch is a handful of parched corn turned to paste with hot water and salt. It tastes like nothing, and everything hot, belly-filling, permission to keep going. Now the hard patience, dressing each plank. You brace a slab against a joist, plant your feet wide, and use the axe like a plane, taking paper-thin pairings off the high places until the surface stops catching the blade. When your swing gets greedy, the axe digs and leaves a trough you'll have to shave out. You slow down and let the tool teach. When your eyes lie to you, your hands tell the truth, the palm finds bumps, your gaze forgives. Cooper shows you a trick for edges. Hold the axe almost vertical. Drift the blade so only the beard, the bottom rear corner, touches the wood. And you can peel a clean arris that will sit tight against its neighbor. Tight means fewer drafts. Tight means fewer splinters in a midnight barefoot. When you leap up because you dreamed a bear was in the doorway and then remembered you. Didn't dream at all last time. You lay the first plank across the joists and tamp it with your heel, sliding it up against a peg you set for the wall line. It sits. It belongs. The second meets it with a gap you don't love but accept. There's no mill here. There's you. You close the worst seams with moss dry, springy, stuffed with your own fingers. Feel your fingertips come back to life from the work of pushing warmth into stubborn cracks by mid-afternoon. Half the Cabin has boards, each one a story you could tell about a knot or a cut or the way the grain tried to trick you. When you stand on the new floor and look back at the dirt half, it's like seeing a past life you can't believe you tolerated. Sleeping platform, Fitzgerald says, and points at the north corner where the drafts are least. High enough to keep you off the breath of the ground. Not so high you learn to fly when you roll over in your sleep. You notch 2 ledger rails into the war logs, flatten their top faces like you did the joists, and run to posts down to the floor too. Catch the outer edge. The frame comes together with shoulders and cheeks cut on the posts, joinery rough but serviceable, tightened with wedges driven from above. You lay short planks across, the same split and shave as the floor, and then pile green pine boughs on top until they spring. The smell is clean and bright resin and cold and a ghost of summer. You put your blanket on it and sit down like a king who remembers he used to sleep in a ditch. It's not soft, it's not square, it's not level. It is a miracle outside. The light is a steel coin sliding toward the horizon. Wolves call from the far ridge in staggered harmony, and somewhere under it a single owl stitches the air with its question. The fire answers both in a voice of sparks. Cooper ducks back in with a rabbit that looks as surprised as you felt when he tossed it to you. Snares paid a dividend, he says. Small, but it's protein. You skin it over the doorway to let the hide keep the blood off your new floor. The meat roasts on sticks while Fitzgerald shows you how to set a poker by the hearth so the heat throws toward the bunk and the table, not straight up the chimney. Fire is a lazy worker if you let it, he says. Point it at the job. You eat, drink hot water like it's a luxury, and stare at your handiwork until your eyes stop seeing and start feeling. There's something about wood you worked, how it catches light, the way its roughness smooths where your hands have asked it to behave, that speaks to you in a language you didn't know you could hear before you sleep. You run your palm across the bunk one more time. It will stab you with a splinter some night soon. You know it. You'll pull it with your teeth and laugh. For now, it is the difference between a man who shakes awake to a spine full of ice and a man who wakes because he has rested enough to hear danger coming. You bank the fire, set the poker to nudge heat out, and climb onto the boughs. The cabin creaks and answers the night. You answer back by closing your eyes and trusting your own work. It holds. Asterisk, the morning is a clean blade. Sunlight hits the snow in the clearing and shatters into a million cold diamonds that blind you. When you glance out through the oiled rawhide, window square you lashed into the south wall late last night, the cold feels less like weather and more like an animal pacing, testing, waiting for a mistake. Inside, the fire is obedient. Your floor is dry. Your bunk is warm enough that you had a dream. Not of towns or women or food, though you'll take those when they come, but of a house that breathes with you. When you wake, you realize that's what this is now. Not a stack of logs, but a thing with a rhythm. It asks to be kept. It asks you to be worthy of it. Today's work isn't about keeping the roof off your face or the wind out of your bones. Today's work is about order, the difference between living and just not dying. Men in empty rooms lose their minds. Men in rooms with places for things keep theirs a little longer. Pegs, Fitzgerald says, and he points to the inner faces of the logs near the door, where the wood is full and unlikely to split out. Angle them up. A peg that points down throws. Your rifle on the floor when it feels lively. A peg that points up keeps your rifle where you left it when you jump to grab it. You cut a dozen pegs from a tough, springy sapling, taper one end of each with clean, rotating cuts, and drive them into augerless holes by splitting the log's face, a hair with the tip of your knife, and then tapping the peg home so the split closes and grips it. Above the door, 2 pegs sit wide enough to cradle your rifle stock and barrel. You lift the rifle into its new berth and feel your shoulders loosen. Not from safety, there's no such thing here, but from readiness. Your weapon has a home, and that makes the room feel like it does too. Shelves next, Cooper says, running a hand along the east wall where the logs are truest. High for dry goods and powder. Mice are climbers, but they're lazy climbers. Make them work for supper, and they'll eat the other man's first. You rive thin slabs from a small, straight pine and hew one face flat enough to sit without wobble. The supports are nothing more than longer pegs with a shoulder carved on. The top small flat spots shaved into the peg at the right height. You drive the supports, then lay the shelf boards across and pin them in place with short pegs dropped into holes drilled through shelf into support. It's carpentering without a carpenter's tools, but it holds, and holding is the standard. You lay out your world. Flint and steel in a bark tray you stitched with rawhide. The whetstone wrapped in a scrap of oiled buckskin, set where it won't absorb damp. Powder horn high and back, away from sparks and bravado. A tiny roll of linen for cleaning. A bone needle stuck into the wood so you don't spend an hour looking for it with frozen fingers while your boot is bleeding you out. Salt goes into a lidded cup you carve from a knot with slow satisfaction, a little piece of store-bought life, made from a tree's elbow. On the middle shelf you set everyday tools. The tin cup, the pot, the spoon you whittled poorly and then sanded with snow and a handful of ash until it stopped biting your lip. Below that, you stack folded strips of hide for patches, a short coil of rawhide for lashings, a twist of sinew dried and ready to chew soft when you need to sew wounds, the leather kind and the flesh kind table. Fitzgerald says, a man stooping to eat will get old in the back by January. Need a flat to work on. Need a place to sign your name in the years. The top is a broad slab you split from a larger log and then planed with the axe for an hour until it agreed to be tabletop instead of log top. The legs are 3, not 4. 4 legs argue with the floor and each other. 3 legs will stand on a rock, a mule, or a floor you made when you were hungry. You cut tapered mortises into the underside of the slab with your knife and axe tip, and drive the legs home. The whole thing leans like a drunk for a second until you trim a hair off the longest leg, and then there it is. The quiet that means stable. Beside it, you build a stool. A single board seat, 3 legs punched through, wedged with slivers so they can't pull out, and splayed enough that the thing won't dump you on your back when you forget you're tired. Settling onto it at the new table feels like uncovering a memory of civilization you didn't know you missed. Eating on a surface you raised changes the taste of food. It is, objectively, still jerky and parched corn. It tastes like work turned into comfort, and that tastes better than spice. You lash a small rack near the hearth for drying. Socks and gloves too, cross sticks pegged to uprights, so you can drape wet wool and hear the hiss of steam off your day while you watch the fire. Turn it back into useful. You rig a tiny shelf just above the fireplace opening for tinder and fire bundle, so you never again stumble around the room with a coal in your hands looking for something that will take it. You show the cabin what goes where, and the cabin shows you it will remember if you do. In the afternoon, Cooper takes you out into the newly quiet woods to set more snares, along the rabbit runs that dive under brush and weave between saplings. He shows you a place where the snow is scalloped with tiny prints. That's where they hesitate, he says. Set a snare there. You twist rawhide fine. Make a loop the size of your palm and set it at head height for a hair, fixed to a bent sapling under tension so the snare will lift what it catches and keep it from chewing free. It's a bad business and a necessary one. And you say thanks in your chest to a thing you haven't named for the meat you hope will be there. Tomorrow, back at the cabin, you take an hour to sharpen steel. It's dull, enviable work. A dull axe is dangerous. A dull knife is a liar. You soak the stone, circle the blade in little figure eights. Feel the edge come back between your fingers rather than seeing it with your eyes. You strop on the inside of your belt until the edge bites hair silently. You lightly oil steel with a smear of grease, not much. Just enough to keep weather from taking back what the forge gave you. As the sky lowers, to evening, you realize something has shifted inside the room that has nothing to do with temperature. The cabin is organized not just for utility, but for the human habit of reaching for a thing in the place you taught your hand to find it. The shelves mean you won't kick your powder horn into the coals searching for your spoon. The pegs mean your rifle won't fall in the dark and put a hard sound in your heart that takes a month to forget. The table means you'll write a mark on a piece of birch bark one night this winter and it will be a date. And when you reach the spring, you'll know you didn't dream the months. Fitzgerald packs his pipe and leans his shoulder to the log. Beside the hearth, studying your work like a man judges a young horse. You're thinking like a man who plans to live, he says finally. That sentence expands the room. You eat at your table like a king at a rough court. The stool wobbles once and then thinks better of it. You hang your gloves on the drying rack and feel the ache leave your fingers like a bird that finally found a hole in the wall. You rest your rifle on its pegs and your eyes on the moving light inside the hearthstone and your heart on the simple weight of a world in its places. Before sleep, you walk a slow circle of the room, palm open, touching each thing and saying its name out loud, not for show, but because naming makes it real. Rifle, powder, flint, axe, stone, spoon, salt, needle, rope, wood. Your voice makes the cabin feel less empty. Your order makes winter feel less large. The wind noses the door and finds the latch shut. It backs away and tries the roof and finds bark overlapped right in moss, stuffed stubborn. It goes looking for a softer house. Not this one, not tonight. Asterisk, you learn a new sound before dawn. The long, low freight train moan of weather finding its second wind. It slides down the ridge and hits the north face of your cabin broadside. The logs answer each one with its own voice-tiny adjustments, dry creaks. A murmur in the chinking where yesterday's mud and moss are trying to remember. The shape of stillness. Snow starts to sift again, but this time the flakes are small and hard, like ground glass. They sting your cheeks when you stick your head out the door to listen to the forest tell the forecast. The pines are whispering to each other in a tight, fast sibilance. That's a warning, wind with nowhere to go. Inside the fire puffs once, backhands smoke at your face, and then recovers. Fitzgerald coughs, wipes his eyes, and says, "We finish the chinking before the wind finishes us." Chinking is the unglamorous work of making a house actually a house. The big logs are theatre. The chink is the script. Without it, winter walks in through 100 little doors and sits on your chest while you sleep. You mix more mortar, dirt chopped from the least frozen layer near the hearth, ashes for bite, a little grease to help it shed water, pine needles to give it body like hair. In plaster, The smell is earth and smoke and the faint metallic temps of cold. Cooper tests a pinch between finger and thumb. Too wet and it slumps out, he says. Too dry and it crumbles. Aim for stubborn. You start on the wall that takes the wind. With numb fingers you shove moss into the long seams, the soft green acting as a spring that fights to fill every shape hand you follow with the mud paste. Pressing hard with your knuckles, smearing with your thumb pads, working the mix into the gaps until your fingerprints rub off on the logs in grey-brown whirls. You learn to avoid the temptation to smooth it pretty. A rough surface sheds water better and holds more mud. Pretty is for spring. Spring is a rumour. Fitzgerald moves along behind you with a stick he whittled to a tula fat end to tamp, a thin end to pack into tight places. He hums under his breath, an old travelling tune without words. In time with his rhythm, you fall into a pattern. Moss, mud, tamp, stroke, glance for daylight. A pinhole of light is an invitation to cold you do not wish to send dot at the corners, where the log ends jut out and create trouble for both wind and water. You lay extra care wedging little twists of moss like caulking, smearing mud into hairline cracks you might have ignored yesterday. When you stand and look back, the wall looks messy and whole at the same time, like a scar that is proud of what it repaired. The storm surges. Snow rattles the bark roof like thrown sand. There are places where the bark sheets lifted a hair. You see snow dust floating in shafts of grey light and feel anger rise a flash, hot and useless. You set it down. Work answers weather. Anger doesn't. Cooper grabs a bundle of moss and points with his chin. I'll climb, you feed. He shoulders the ladder, leans it into the rafters, and disappears into the shadow above the ridge beam. You hand up fistfuls of moss lengths. Of bark you saved, wedges of stick. He jams, ties, and coaxes until the snow dust slows to a fine suggestion. When he comes down, his hair and beard are gritted white like a miller's. He grins, and the grin cracks the powder into a joke heel. Till later, you break for water and a quick mouthful. Outside is white noise and white sightline, no trees, no creek, no world, just motion. Inside, the air is warmer by 5 degrees than it would have been an hour ago. That is not exaggeration. It is the geometry of less wind back to it, east. While next the fireplace side. Here, chinking isn't just about drafts, it's about safety. Sparks find cracks the way mice find grain. You smear mud along every seam for 2 log courses above the mantel, then smash a little extra into the tiny hairline between stone and wood where the heat licks and tests. You think of the ember that tried to start a new idea on your floor yesterday, and your belly tightens like a fist. Fire is a good dog until it isn't. You decide to sleep tonight with the poker in the coals and a lid of wet bark ready to smother. A tantrum at noon. The wind comes around to the west a touch and tries your door like a drunk pounding on the wrong house. The latch holds. The lever hinges groan but don't tear. You make a note to reinforce the hinge pegs with an extra dowel and a prayer. Fitzgerald shows you an old trick for inside corners where the draft hides. Ash paste. You collect white ash from the hearth, wet it to a slurry, and brush it into the fine seams with a fir bough. When it dries, it powders into the gaps and makes a serpentite seal. It looks like nothing. It feels like less wind in your hair when you stand by the wall for a minute in silence. The house breathes different. The house is grateful and shows it the only way it can by keeping another inch of winter out. Mid-afternoon, you hear a sound. That doesn't belong to weather, a dense, muffled thump on the bark roof, and then the slow, sliding crumble of snow sloughing away. You and Cooper look at each other with the same thought, load. If bark catches too much snow and the purlins flex, you could wake under winter itself. Pole, Cooper says, already grabbing the push pole you whittled from a sapling. He opens the door into a wall of pearl and pushes up under the eaves from inside, feeling for the weight. The bark rises, sheds a bellyful of snow in a long, sighing avalanche, and settles back. The roof answers with a contented creak and then shuts up. You add roof pole to the list of tools that earn their keep in 10 seconds flat. The fire pops a sharp, bright crackle spits an ember the size of a thumbnail that lands on a plank with malicious precision. You're there in 2 steps. Crush it under your boot and hold your foot there too long just to make the point. The black kiss it leaves on the wood smells like a memory you would rather not repeat. That, Fitzgerald says without looking up, is why men who live keep a wet mop by the hearth. He hands you a bunch of shredded willow bark, twisted into a pad and dunked in the water pot. You lay it near the fire and know you'll reach for it in your sleep if you have to. By late afternoon, the walls wear their chinking like a new coat. It's not nice. It's effective. The cabin's interior has shifted from drafty to still, and with stillness comes a new sound. Your own breathing in the gaps between crackle and wind. You learn to love that sound because it means all your work is warming the air you'll inhale. Cooper checks, the chimney with the practiced nose of a man who has seen one too many cabins turn into rockets. He holds his hand in the throat, feels. Draw, nods. Not perfect, but true enough, he says. We'll sweep it with a juniper branch every week, or you'll be telling stories to flames on the rafters. You gather offcuts and splinters and decide not to burn all of them. Dry. Kindling is banked wealth. You bind a bundle and hang it from a peg, away from sparks where rising heat will keep it crisp. It looks like a broom. It's insurance. Near dusk, the storm relents just enough that the sound of trees returns to the world adeep, slow flexing like ships in a harbor. You step outside with your coat collar up and the door cracked behind you and look at the cabin. It sits snug, smoke straightening more often than it curls, eaves shedding small snow tears, door edges packed with drift but not leaking. A week ago, this was all ideas and hunger. Now it is stubborn fact. Back inside, you sit at your table and blow on your hands and feel a peculiar rush that tastes like winning a fight you didn't think you could win. Not triumph, you're too honest for that, but something close. The wind can campaign all night. Your chinking will campaign back, and this time it will hold ground. You boil a little stew in the patrobit bone for flavor, a scrape of fat, a swallow of parched corn to thicken it into a paste. You call it stew to keep your mind friendly. You eat slowly. You spend more time watching the flame than you spend reading the pot. The flame is a language. Today it says, you did enough dot before you banked the fire. You walk the walls with your palm, feeling for leaks the old mountain man trick. Your hand finds a thread of air no wider than a baby's breath. You stuff it with moss, smear a thumb of mud, and feel the leak die. You smile like a thief who got away with something. You did. You stole a square foot of warmth from a winter. That thought it owned it. Bed is pine boughs under blanket, rifle above the door. Axe leaning where your hand falls if your mind doesn't wake as fast as your ears. You place the wet mop where your sleep can find it. You tell the fire what you want with it. Glow, not blaze. Heat, not pride. It listens. because you built its throat right and fed it steady all day. The storm throws one last shoulder into the north wall at midnight. The wall tightens and shrugs. The house breathes in and out like a big tired animal that trusts you enough to sleep. You turn on your side and feel the chinking at your back through the logs as a kind of silence. Tomorrow the wind will have a new idea. Tomorrow you will have a new answer. Tonight the answer is simple. This house stands. This man, too. Asterisk, the storm quit in the night, not so much leaving as stepping outside to catch its breath. Dawn finds the clearing hard and glittering, a world hammered flat by wind, crusted with ice where snow thawed and refroze under yesterday's warm breath from the hearth. Your cabin sits there like a blunt fist low walls, a patched bark roof, where you staged a quick cover, chimney shouldering smoke into the pale air. It looks half-born and stubborn. You feel the same. The fire is banked to a red eye. You coax it open with cedar bark, pencil sticks, then a split of pitchy pine that ignites with that sweet turpentine whisper you've learned to love. Cooper's. Boots thump once, then stop. He's the kind of man who wakes all at once. Fitzgerald rolls to a seat and pulls on his mitts without a word. Men up here talk plenty, but not before the first breath of heat hits the face. Ridge, Fitzgerald says finally, nodding toward the roofline that is not yet a roofline. 3 syllables, no speech. Everyone knows the weight in that word. A cabin without a spine is a promise it can't keep. Rafters will need something true to land on. Snow will need a path to shed. Wind will need to be asked, politely but firmly, to go up and over. The ridge beam is all of that, a tree reborn as the sky's load-bearer. Get it wrong, and the roof sags. Water finds seems January finds you. Get it badly wrong, and the beam itself will kill you on the way up. You step outside into air that knifes and then burns. The north face of the cabin is waist-deep in drift. The south face shows hard winds scour, the earth frosted like hammered tin. The creek below is a black ribbon with plates of milk-glass ice along its edges, shifting and chiming in the current. A raven drops from the tree line, gives one flat, amused croak, and sails away an audience of one. Fitzgerald has a way of choosing trees that feels less like selection and more like introduction. He walks the edge of the clearing with his mitts, behind his back, head tilted, as if listening to gossip. He stops before a lodgepole that stands a touch apart, straight as a plum, limbs clean for 30 feet. Grain promised in the even, tight bark. That one's lived kept, he says. She work. Before a cut, you read the ground. Where will it fall? What will it hit? Where will the top kick? Will the butt roll toward the creek? Will the crown tangle a neighbor and twist? You plan the notch where you want her to go, the open lane you kicked yesterday, and you clear escape routes with your boots so you don't have to invent them later. Cooper spits in his palms and looks up through his brows. Back cut a hair high, he says. She's carrying snow on the west side. Hinge wants favor. The undercut is all angles and patience. You chop the face where the tree will bow to. Clean planes meeting like the open mouth of a fish. Chips fly sugary and bright. The resin wakes in the cold like pepper. The rhythm warms the shoulders. You can feel the hinge in your mind before it exists, just enough holding wood to steer, not enough to fight the fall. Fitzgerald tests the kerf with his knife, like a dentist tapping a tooth. He nods. Good. The back cut is work a man should never rush. Cooper's strokes are slower here, careful the axe running level, notching steadily across. He pauses to sight the top, reads the silent story in the heavy snow, sitting up there like a passenger, deciding whether to stay on board or walk. A gust stiffens the crown. The trunk answers with a long groan that vibrates in your knees. Back, Cooper says, and all three of you step to your safe sides. The lodgepole hesitates. Trees with long lives don't like being told the next chapter. But then gravity wins its quiet vote. The hinge tears in long fibers, the top swings. The sound turns from moan to bellow as 100 feet of winter-loaded pine comes down. It rips smaller limbs from its neighbors, slaps the ground hard enough to cough powder into the air, and lies. Still, a fallen spar of green and white. You touch the bark. Thanks, and also, now we go. Limbing is fast for the small stuff brush, flicked with short, snapping cuts that will crack your wrist if you're sloppy. The big branches get an undercut and a top cut so the axe doesn't bind. You learn the trees. Language as you go, where a knot hides under the bark, where a twist in the grain will turn your blade, where a stub will leverage the whole trunk and try to roll it onto your shins. You strip clean to a single, straight log that glows pale where green wood shows and shines dark where pitch seeps like amber blood. Bark will stay on the ridge beam for now. It sheds water in storm and buys time in freeze-thaw. But where the beam will sit in its pockets, you hew clean, to saddle flats cut into the log's underside so the beam kisses the wall tops in wide, friendly contact, not the sharp, splitting bite of a point. Fitzgerald chalks the positions with a burned stick, lays his axe like a compass to set the width, and you shave until the flats looked like they were born there. Moving the beam is its own chapter. Sled, rollers, rope, and pure, unmannered will. You fashion a drag from 2 small pulse travois, style splayed and lashed with rawhide. Cross pieces tied high so they ride over crust and don't plough. The beam rolls onto it with a chorus of groans from 3 men who were born without spare backs. Cooper takes the pull. You and Fitzgerald steer and pry with poles where snow hides rocks and hummocks. Every 20 feet you pause, breathe the iron breath of cold in your teeth, and count in your heads what you're spending. Calories, daylight, luck, dot. At the cabin wall, the real puzzle stands up and says its name. You cannot simply lift a tree. The mountains do not allow heroics that ignore physics. You need a plan that turns weight into distance with more brains than bravado. Deadman, Fitzgerald says, and he points to a spot 20 feet out, from the gable where the drift isn't too deep. You dig there 3 men, cutting a grave in the snow and the frozen ground beneath until you can set a stout, short log, crosswise, half buried. That buried log is your anchor, your friend you cannot see. Rawhide lacing twists into a rope when you pull it wet and let it dry in the cold. You braid lengths together and test each splice by bracing your heels and trying to tear it apart. Cooper takes a pin of hard wood, pounds it through the rope loops into the dead man, and dogs the line around the beam's near end. Now your system exists, an anchor trying to stay put, a rope trying to cut the difference, a beam begging to be persuaded. You set a track against the wall, a little crib of short logs like steps, each higher than the last, pegged with stakes and stamped hard so they won't slip. On the far side, a guideline runs over the top wall, poor man's parbuckle, so the beam is both pulled and kept from rolling. Spanish windlass, Fitzgerald says, and he drives a sapling stake through a bite of the rope, then turns it, like a giant key. Every half turn shortens the distance and tightens the world. You can hear the rawhide sing, asterisk. Count time, 1, 2, 3. Push on the beams, but with your shoulder. Cooper cranks the windlass. Fitzgerald tends the high guide and curses gentle when the rope starts to bite into the wall's top log. He slides a rounded stick under the line so it rides smooth and doesn't saw your work apart. The beam moves, not like a man, like a mountain thinking about it. An inch, then nothing. Then another inch. When the windlass turns a half more, you breathe in sync with force. The track groans, but holds. Snow squeals under weight. A raven somewhere says something disrespectful. Halfway up, the beam decides to remember it's round. It wants to roll, and if it does, it will crush whatever is in the way of its remembering. Hold, Cooper barks, and the word freezes you the way it's supposed to. He kicks a chock into place, drives it with the heel of his boot, and you wedge a second under the far side so the beam can't turn toward you. A moment for hearts to go back where they live, then back to it. At 3/4, everything gets stupid. The angle steepens, the windlass complains, and the rope, damp with breath and snow, makes a sound you associate with bad news. Fitzgerald doesn't look at it, he listens. She hold, he says to the air. She hold, he isn't guessing, he's telling the rawhide what it's going to do. Last lift, Cooper grunts. He plants his feet wide, leans into the stake, unrolls the windlass another quarter. You and your shoulders stand up into the beam like you're trying to carry the sky on your back. For 1 second, which feels like a minute, which feels like a year, the beam slides that final hand's breadth, and the saddled flats you hewed earlier line up with the pockets you scribed in the wall tops. It drops into place with a sound you feel more than hear, a deep, throat-clearing thud that travels through the logs, down your bones, into the ground. The cabin answers walls, settling a hair, rafters doobie, imagining themselves. The chimney throwing a curl of smoke like applause. You back away without meaning to, just to see it. The long line of the ridge running true from gable to gable, proud and level, no sway, no snipe. The beam owns the space above the room, the way a keel owns the sea under a hull. Suddenly the cabin looks like a house in the making, not a stack of problems. Now you make it safe. Temporary props go up to interior queen posts under the ridge at thirds, shaped notches catching the underside so the beam isn't asking the green wall logs to bear its whole weight while they're still learning their new job. You wedged the posts tight with dry shims that sing when the mallet seats them. You lash the beam to the wall, tops with rawhide collars so wind can't walk it sideways before the rafters lock it in. Fitzgerald squints along the beam, one eye closed, the other sharp. She's got truth, he says, which means more up here than level. You don't have a spirit level, but you have a water tuber length of gut tied off with a bubble in the middle, and the bubble centers when you lay it across. The cabin passes a test older than the tool. Cooper runs his palm over the beam's edge where your axe left facets. Leave her proud, he says. Spring sun will want to kiss it. You look at your hands. The cuts you didn't feel are showing now thin red signatures that fire when the blood returns. You wrap one with a strip of buckskin and spit in the knot to shrink it. It hurts the way a thing hurts when it mattered. Inside, the fire has burned down to coals. You rake them, lay on splits, and watch the room change color from iron to copper, to honey as heat spreads. Smoke curls up, gets caught in the new geometry, and folds itself out the throat like it approves the addition. You lean the top of your skull against the warm beam for a second, a foolish benediction, and the wood gives back a heat that feels older than you. Out the door, the afternoon has turned brittle. The sun is a coin slid toward the edge of the world. You and Cooper drag a few rafters to be near the wall and scribe their birdsmiths where they'll sit. Tomorrow's work is already sketched in smoke and sawdust. Set rafters, string purlins, skin with bark again, but cleverer, stitch moss tighter. Build a ladder you trust with your life twice. Fitzgerald tears a strip from a rabbit Cooper snared. At dawn tosses it in the pot with a handful of parched corn and a sliver of fat. The stew takes the edge of hunger and puts a little shine on the eyes. You eat at the table you built yesterday, elbows on wood you planed yourself. The beam overhead takes the firelight and throws it back in a long, warm band, like a road you can walk with your gaze. Men die lifting those. Fitzgerald says without drama, nodding up. More die for roofs built wrong. You nod, agreement, respect, and a quiet inventory of how close you came when the rope sang. Night pulls its hood up. The wind returns, but it's a different wind one that prowls the eaves and finds fewer handholds. The beam speaks a little in tiny ticks as cold tightens it. The posts answer, and then all three of you stop hearing it. A house's small noises become the silence you measure everything else against. When you bank the fire and crawl onto the pine bough bed, the weight of the day presses your muscles flat in the best way, like a heavy blanket you earned. Above your face, the new line of the ridge is a scripture written in wood, straight, sufficient, honest. You close your eyes under it and feel, for the first time, that the sky could put its hand on your roof and your roof would not bow. Tomorrow, ribs. The day after, skin. But tonight, the cabin has a spine, and so do you. Asterisk, the ridge beam holds. That's the first truth you wake to. During the night, it ticked and sighed as it settled into the notches you carved, but it never shifted, never. Groaned under the push of the wind outside. That sound wind that once felt like an enemy now plays against walls and a beam that fight back. It's different waking in a shelter that owns a spine. You stretch on your pine bough bed, sore but not broken, and feel the weight of work. Waiting. A house with only a ridge is a spine with no ribs. It can't breathe. It can't shed snow. Today you will build ribs the rafters that will catch storms, break them, and pass them to the earth. Choosing the rafters, Fitzgerald takes you to the stand of young lodgepoles he marked the day before. Not giants, but slender ones, 12 to 15 feet long, as straight as arrows, with just enough flex. Rafters want truth and forgiveness, he says. Straight enough to set true, limber enough to bend when snow heaps on them. You fell them quickly. Compared to ridge timber, it feels like picking berries. The axe bites twice and a tree sighs into the snow. You limb, strip, and drag them to the clearing, stacking them neatly. By midday you have a dozen, enough for one side of the roof. You'll need twice that before nightfall. Your gloves are soaked with sap. The smell of pine is thick in your throat. The sweat under your buckskins chills fast whenever you pause. Cooper notices and tosses you a strip of dried venison. Chew, don't stop swinging, or you'll freeze faster than meat in a smokehouse. Shaping bird's mouth yak, rafter needs a notch at the bottom where it will rest on the wall log. Not just any cut will do. If you sit a rafter flat, the weight of snow will shear it off. You must carve a birdsmith, little L-shaped seat that hugs the top log, one side pressing on the wall, the other braced against the inside. Fitzgerald demonstrates with slow, precise strokes of his axe. The cut is awkward, dangled down, then across, then cleaned with the knife until the notch cradles would like it was born there. You copy him, clumsy at first, but the rhythm comes. Measure, mark, cut, test. A wrong angle means the rafter slides like a greased sled. You can't afford wrong angles. By the time the sun dips toward the western ridge, half your rafters are notched and ready. Your hands are numb, blood crusting where blisters split again. Cooper checks one of your birdsmiths and grunts approval. For him, that's almost praise. The first lift asterisk, the ridge beam waits like a judge. Getting the rafters up is a dance with weight and balance. Cooper shows you how to prop a crude ladder against the wall of forked sapling lashed with crossbars. It sways dangerously under your boots as you climb, rafter in hand, heart hammering with each step dot at the top. Fitzgerald steadies the log while you hook the birdsmith over the wall log. Then, with a coordinated heave, you raise the rafter until its top end kisses the ridge beam. It fits barely. The notch you carved their cradles, the ridge like hands folded in prayer. When you step back down and look, the line of the first rafter is a revelation. One rib of a skeleton that will soon shield you from storms. Good, Fitzgerald says simply. A rhythm of threether work finds its rhythm. Cooper cuts and props rafters at the base. You climb and set them into the wall notches. Fitzgerald stands on the ridge, balancing like a crow, guiding each rafter into place, adjusting angles, calling out corrections. The three of you speak little. Words waste breath. The work itself is language. A nod here, a grunt there, the scrape of axe steel, the hiss of wind through the trees. You sweat and curse and nearly slip once, your boot skidding on snow as you balance a log across your shoulders. Fitzgerald's hand clamps your arm before you fall. He doesn't comment, just sets the rafter himself, movements steady as time dot by mid-afternoon. 6 rafters lean against the ridge on one side, 6 more on the other, forming a skeleton of triangles. They hold each other, balance across the spine, defy the storm gathering again on the horizon. Cross pieces and lashings. Rafters alone aren't enough. They must be tied, braced, made a family. Cooper cuts thinner poles purlins, lashes them across the rafters horizontally. The rawhide bindings squeal as they dry, pulling tight until the roof frame stiffens, like a shield. Your arms ache from hauling, your fingers bleed from knots, but the structure takes shape. Where there was only sky above yesterday, there is now a lattice of wood, angles converging, geometry that defies chaos. Fitzgerald squints at the horizon. Snow clouds roll in fast, black-bellied, dragging wind ahead of them. We'll not cover it proper tonight, he says, but ribs are up. She'll take snow now without breaking. Evening in the half-house inside. The fire burns against the stone of the new hearth. Smoke rises clean. The rafters above show through the gaps, a web of black lines against a stormlit sky. Snow begins to fall, hissing as it touches hot stones. Drifting against the walls, the three of you eat rabbit stewcuppers, snares paid again. The meat is stringy, but the fat coats your throat like bomb. Fitzgerald smokes his pipe, gaze fixed on the rafters. You've built bones, he says, exhaling a thread of smoke. Tomorrow we give her skin. You lie on your pine bough bed that night listening to the storm hammer. Snow drives against the bark roof, sifts through cracks, but the rafters hold. They creak, they whisper, but they do not break. And that's enough. For the first time since the storm season began, you believe the cabin might outlast winter. Not just survive endure. Asterisk, the rafters stand now like ribs of some ancient beast, black silhouettes against a storm-grey sky. Yesterday they were just wood you cut, sweat, curses, and rawhide lashings. Today they are a frame against which winter itself will break. But without skin, bones alone won't keep you alive. The snow will sift through, the wind will whistle, the cold will seep in like a thief. Today is about skin covering, ceiling, clothing, this skeleton of logs with a roof that sheds storms and walls that stop the bite of the wind, bark, shingles. And Pine Boughs Fitzgerald shows you how to peel bark. It isn't pretty, work it's slow, dangerous, and wasteful if you don't know how. He wedges his axe head under the thick plates of pine bark on a fallen trunk and pries until the bark shears free in wide, curling sheets. Each sheet weighs heavy in the hands, rough as stone on one side, slick and resinous on the other. Lay them like fish scales, he says. Bottom up, overlap tight. Water runs down, don't let it run in. You climb the rough ladder again, boots slipping on snow-slick rungs, arms loaded with bark sheets. One by one, you place them across the rafters, starting low at the eaves, overlapping them so the next layer shields the seam of the last. The roof begins to look less like ribs, more like armor. Where bark breaks, you stuff moss. Where bark leaves a gap, you lash crosssticks to hold it down against wind. Cooper adds spruce boughs on top needle-thick mats, layered until the whole roof smells like a forest floor in summer. The work is endless, your gloves shredded, your hands blistered anew. But by mid-afternoon, the cabin has a skin, not watertight, not perfect, but a roof a surface that will shed snow, that will blunt the claws of a storm. Chinking the walls, the roof is only half the battle. The walls, rough logs stacked in notches, gape with cracks big enough to lose a finger in. Each gap is a funnel for wind, a thief of warmth, a whispering hole where death can reach in. You mix mortar like an alchemist of mud. From the dirt under the floor, you dig dark soil, still soft beneath the frost. You mix it with melted snow until it forms a paste, then add moss, pine needles, and ash scraped from the fireplace. The mixture steams in the cold air, a strange, living thing in your hands. Together, the three of you jam it into every crack. First moss, pushed deep with sticks and frozen fingers. Then mud, smeared across, pressed until it bulges. Then ash, sprinkled to harden it. Your gloves are soaked, your nails packed with dirt, your palms raw. But the walls begin to change. Where once they leaked cold, now they are sealed tight. The wind no longer whistles through. The fire inside burns hotter, steadier, its warmth staying longer. You work until your back knots and your knees tremble. Cooper pauses only to spit, wipe his hands on his breeches, and start again. Fitzgerald hums tunelessly, the sound of an old man who has done this before, maybe a dozen times in a dozen winters, and knows there's no shortcut. The door and the window shelter isn't shelter if wind walks through the front. The cabin needs a door-knot canvas, not a blanket, but wood. You split logs again, rive planks from a straight pine until you have enough for a rough slab. Cooper shows you how to pin them together with cross braces, lashed with rawhide, hinges. Aren't iron here, they're strips of wet leather, nailed into place with pegs, stiffening as they dry until they swing like stiff joints. The door hangs heavy, creaking, but it closes. Fitzgerald whittles a latch from antler, a simple pivot that drops into a notch. Primitive, but when you push the door shut and hear that click, something inside you relaxes. The cabin is whole now. A window is a luxury, but light matters. You cut a small square on the south wall, Cover it with a sheet of rawhide, stretched tight and oiled until it turns translucent. The light that filters through is weak, yellowed, but enough to keep the dark at bay. Testing the work by late afternoon. The snow thickens, driven sideways by gusts that rattle the treetops. You step outside and watch it strike the new roof. Instead of sifting down through rafters onto your bed, it slides, piling at the eaves, shedding in soft sheets. The walls do not whistle, the door stays shut. The chimney smokes true dot, it's still, crude. The bark roof leaks where sheets cracked. The chinking freezes in places, pulling away, but it's yours. For the first time since you stepped into these mountains, you stand in front of something that looks like home. Supper in shelter that night. The three of you huddle around the fire inside. The roof muffles the wind, the walls hold back the snow. Cooper boils rabbit with a handful of dried corn. Fitzgerald smokes his pipe, the smoke rising cleanly through the chimney instead of choking the room. You sit on your new stool, boots off, steam rising from your socks near the fire. The cabin smells of smoke, pine, sweat, and stew a perfume richer than anything in St. Louis. You lean back against the log wall, rough but solid, and feel warmth. Stay with you instead of fleeing through cracks. Fitzgerald taps his pipe against the hearthstone. You built this, he says. Not pretty, but pretty don't keep you alive. This'll do. Cooper just grunts, tears, a hunk of rabbit with his teeth, and passes you a share. You eat, staring into the flames, knowing that tomorrow the storm may test this cabin with all its fury. But tonight you've built a fortress, not just logs stacked in the woods, but shelter. The line between life and death has shifted a little in your favor. Asterisk, the storm came again that night, heavier than before, driving snow sideways so hard it felt like the wind itself wanted to tear the forest out by the roots. The sound of it out in the trees was like an ocean crashing endlessly, waves of white rolling and breaking against the ridge. But this time you weren't lying beneath open rafters, you weren't clutching a blanket against the sting of flakes drifting through cracks. This time you were inside something you built with your own hands. The roof caught the weight of snow and shed it down the slope, the bark shingles groaning under the pressure but holding. The chinked walls no longer whistled, no longer let icy drafts creep over your body like fingers in the night. The fire burned bright in its stone cradle, the smoke rising cleanly up and out instead of choking your lungs. For the first time since you set foot in these mountains, you felt what it was to be defended. Not safe, never safe, but defended. You lay awake for a while on your bed of pine boughs, listening. The cabin made its own music now, not just the storm outside. Logs creaked as frost tightened them. The roof ticked with settling bark. The chimney hummed like a low throat as the fire pulled air upward. Every sound might have unnerved you once, but now they were signs of life. Your cabin was breathing along with you, resisting winter one groan at a time. Fitzgerald muttered in his sleep on the far side of the fire, a low growl that might have been a dream of wolves. Cooper snored like a saw working through green pine. Their presence, once strangers, now filled the place with something you hadn't realized you were missing until it returned companionship. The faint but vital comfort of other men's voices in the night. When morning broke, the world was buried. You had to shoulder the door hard against the drift that pressed it shut. Outside, snow had climbed up the cabin's sides to your waist, smooth and blinding in the light. The air was cruel, sharp enough to freeze your breath before it left your beard, but the roof stood, the walls stood. The chimney trailed its thin banner of smoke into the blue sky. You looked at it and felt a swelling you couldn't name, a mixture of pride, relief, and awe at the fact that you had taken pieces of forest and bent them into something that could hold back death itself. Every aching muscle, every blister and cut, every night of doubt had been hammered into these walls. The day was spent shoring up what the storm had tested. You climbed to the roof again, brushing snow aside, checking where bark had cracked and split. You patched gaps with fresh sheets peeled from fallen trunks, pressing them into place with numb fingers until the roof felt tight again. Cooper worked the fireplace, resetting stones loosened by heat, packing more mud and ash into the seams until smoke curled upward, steady and true. Fitzgerald mixed more chinking, his hands black with soot and soil, and stuffed it into hairline. Cracks you hadn't even noticed before. The three of you moved as one. No wasted words, no questions of who did what. Each man simply saw what needed doing and did it, because hesitation meant cold creeping back in. Hours passed like minutes, and when you finally stepped back, the cabin looked stronger, tighter, more sure of itself. Inside that night the fire burned hot, the smoke rising clean. You hung your wet gloves and socks on sticks by the hearth, watching steam lift off them in ghostly wisps. Cooper produced a rabbit from his snares, skinned it in a few deft strokes, and dropped it into a pot of water with a handful of corn. The stew bubbled, filling the air with a smell so rich you closed your eyes just to breathe it in. When you ate, grease running into your beard, it felt like more than food. It was proof that you had taken wilderness and forced it to yield shelter, warmth, sustenance. Proof that this winter would not break you easily. As the night deepened, the storm finally blew itself out. The silence afterward was immense, the kind that rang in your ears after days of howling wind. You stepped outside for a moment, boots crunching on crusted snow, and looked back at the cabin. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney into a sky pricked with hard, cold stars. The walls glowed faintly with the fire's light leaking through. The seams, it wasn't pretty, not by any measure of the world you'd left behind. But in that moment, in that frozen clearing ringed with endless dark trees, it looked like a palace, a fortress, a home. And when you stepped back inside, shutting the rawhide hinged door against the cold, you realized something had changed. You were no longer simply surviving day by day, clinging to scraps of warmth and luck. You had built something that could last, something that might carry you through the worst winter the mountains could throw. And as you stretched out by the fire, muscles slack with exhaustion, eyes heavy with sleep, you thought to yourself, I just might make it. The days after the storm blurred into a rhythm of endless work, but for the first time since you'd set foot in this wilderness, the labor no longer felt like a fight you were losing. The cabin was no longer a loose frame of logs, it was a breathing thing, and every stroke of the axe, every handful of mud stuffed into a seam, every stone dragged from the frozen creek made it stronger. You woke each morning stiff, hands so swollen you could hardly wrap them around the axe handle, yet you rose anyway because the cabin demanded it. And in truth, you needed it just as much as it needed you. Cooper was the first up most mornings, feeding the fire back to life before the frost could settle too deep into your bones. Fitzgerald followed, stretching his wiry frame and grumbling at the stiffness in his back, but always ready with a plan for the day. There was never a shortage of things to do. Firewood had to be stockpiled, not for days, but for months, because in this country a single cold snap could drain your pile in a week. More logs had to be split, more planks cut for shelves, more bark hauled for patching leaks. The work stretched on like the horizon, no end to it, no point where you could say enough. One morning, Fitzgerald declared the floor unfinished. He stomped on the rough planks with a boot and pointed to the dirt still visible through gaps. "Cold creeps through there like a snake," he muttered. "Man can't fight a winter if he sleeps on frost." So you and Cooper split more logs, shaved them flat, fitted them tight across the joists until the whole cabin floor was covered. It wasn't smooth, not like mill boards, but when you spread fresh pine boughs across the sleeping platform and stretched your blanket on top, you could feel the difference. The cold no longer seeped straight into your bones. You were lifted, separated from the earth that had been trying to claim you since October. Then came the shelves. At Fitzgerald's urging, you cut small logs, flattened them with endless strokes of the axe, and pegged them into the wall above the sleeping platform. Each shelf became a precious piece of order, a place to lay tools, food, powder, anything. You couldn't risk losing on the damp floor. The first time you set your possibles bag on that shelf, out of reach of mice and moisture, a strange satisfaction washed over your organization as survival. The cabin wasn't just a shelter now. It was becoming a place a man could live. The fireplace drew well enough, but Cooper insisted on building it higher. "Smoke will sneak back down when the snow drifts," he warned. So you hauled more stones from the creek, your shoulders screaming from the weight, your breath clouding in the brittle air. Mud was mixed with melted snow until your hands stung, with cold, then packed into the chimney stones until your fingernails cracked and bled. By the time the sun sank, the chimney stood taller, and when you tested it with a fire, the draft pulled smoke up so clean you could almost imagine you were in a house back east instead of a crude fort on the edge of nowhere. The days shortened, until dusk came before you felt you'd even begun. But each evening, after the work, came the fire, the warmth, and the rough comfort of company. The three of you ate together, swapping silence for scraps of story. Fitzgerald spoke once of a winter he'd nearly lost his toes when his cabin floor had collapsed under the snow. Cooper admitted he'd buried a partner years ago after a log slipped and crushed him flat. They told it without drama, without sorrow, just the plain facts of life in the mountains. Death wasn't an enemy. Here it was a neighbor, close enough that you never forgot he was watching. One night, after a long day of cutting rafters for a lean-to to shelter the horses, you stepped outside before sleep. The storm had cleared again, leaving a sky so full of stars it looked like the heavens had torn open. Snow blanketed the clearing, reflecting moonlight so bright you could see every tree etched in silver. The cabin behind you smoked steadily, its roof holding, its walls silent, its door latched with your own crude antler catch. It looked small in that vast wilderness, almost laughable against the sweep of mountains and endless forest. Yet inside those walls was warmth, food, and life. You realized then that survival wasn't about conquering the wilderness. It was about carving out a space, however small, where death couldn't reach for one more day. When you returned inside, the others were already rolled in their blankets, the fire snapping low. You stretched out on your pine bough bed, the scent of resin sharp in your nose, and let the crackle of flames lull you. Outside, wolves howled on a distant ridge, their voices high and mournful, but the sound didn't pierce you as it once had. You had walls between you and them now, a fire of your own, companions who would raise their rifles if need be. You had built something worth defending. The silence of the wilderness pressed close, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with your breathing, your heartbeat, the settling creak of logs, the faint whisper of snow sliding off the roof. You closed your eyes, and for the first time, you didn't dream of the comforts you had left behind. You dreamed of the work yet to come, more wood to cut, traps to set, food to store, ways to strengthen the cabin against the deep months ahead. The future wasn't a burden now, it was a challenge, and you were ready for it. The next morning broke with a silence so complete it startled you awake. For weeks, the mountains had roared storms battering the walls, wind clawing through the trees, wolves and owls filling the nights with their cries. Now there was nothing but stillness, the kind that presses against your ears until your own heartbeat is the loudest sound you know. When you pushed open the door, the world outside had changed into something uncanny. Snow lay in drifts so high it swallowed half the cabin walls, smooth as white stone, glittering under a sky so bright it seemed the air itself was made of glass. The cold hit like a hammer, sharp enough to seize the breath in your throat. But the cabin stood behind you, smoking quietly, unbothered by the weight of winter. You dug yourselves out slowly, using slabs of bark as shovels, pushing snow into heavy banks around the clearing. Cooper muttered that those drifts could be friends as much as foes. They'd seal the cabin further, insulating the walls, giving the wind nothing to pry against. Fitzgerald, squinting at the sky, reckoned the worst of the storm season had broken. Now comes the long grind, he said. Snow don't kill a man fast, it starves him slow. The truth of his words settled over you heavier than the snow. Shelter was built, yes. Warmth was possible, yes. But without food stacked high and firewood piled even higher, none of it mattered. That day you set traps deeper in the timber, your boots sinking thigh deep as you trudged along game trails muffled under snow. Each step was a battle, every breath tearing at your chest. You set snares for hare, deadfalls for marten, and marked each with notched sticks so you could find them again when the next snow covered your tracks. Cooper showed you how to lay bait from the scraps of last night's stew bones, his hands steady even in the killing cold. Meat's money out here, he told you, tightening the noose on a rabbit snare. Without it, man don't last. Not even in a palace. When you returned, Fitzgerald had been working inside the cabin all day. He'd split more logs into crude boards and hammered them into rough shelves along the walls, their uneven surfaces already stacked with powder horns, bags of salt, coils of sinew, and what little food remained. He'd even fashioned a small peg rack above the door where rifles could hang, dry and ready. The place no longer felt like four walls and a fire. It felt lived in. You caught yourself running your hand along one of the shelves, the wood still, damp, smelling of sap, and felt a pride you hadn't known since leaving civilization. Every inch of that cabin was labor. Every corner was a mark of survival. That night, after eating what little remained of the rabbit meat, you sat by the fire with your companions. The light licked the rough logs, casting shadows like moving spirits. Across the walls, Cooper told a story of a partner he'd once had, a man who froze to death less than 10 yards from his cabin because his fire had gone out in the night. Fitzgerald added his tale of a winter where the snow never stopped for a full month, forcing him to burn furniture and even floorboards just to keep alive. They told it plainly, as though discussing weather, but the lesson sat deep in your chest. A cabin was never finished. It demanded constant vigilance, endless care. Survival was not an achievement. It was a duty renewed every day. When the fire dropped to coals, you lay on your pine bough bed, staring up at the roof. Snow had piled so thick on the bark shingles that the cabin groaned under its weight, but it held. The smoke from the chimney drifted upward in a thin, steady line. The rawhide hinged door was closed tight, the shelves stacked neatly, the floor dry beneath your boots. For the first time since stepping into this wilderness, you were not lying in fear of the storm, or the wolves, or the night itself. You were lying in something you built, something that had proven itself worthy. Sleep took you deep. And when you dreamed, it wasn't of leaving this place or longing for comforts back east. You dreamed of the next task, cutting more wood, building a cache, stretching pelts to dry on racks by the fire. You dreamed of the cabin filled with stores of food, the shelves lined with jars of fat and dried meat, the floor swept clean, the roof patched tight against March storms. You dreamed, for the first time, not of bare survival, but of living, of enduring, of a season passing with you still standing at the other end. When you woke, the fire was low but still alive, the stones of the hearth holding its heat. Cooper was already stirring it back to flame, and Fitzgerald was crouched by the door, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Outside, the silence still reigned, cold and vast and eternal. But inside, the cabin was warmth, order, the pulse of human life. You realized then that you had crossed some invisible line. You were no longer just a man trapped in the wilderness, fighting to stay alive 1 hour at a time. You were a mountain man now, with a roof, a hearth, and walls that held against the storm. You had bent the wilderness to your will, and though death still waited just beyond the tree line, tonight it would find you behind a door, beside a fire, with a cabin of your own. Asterisk through the long weeks that followed, the cabin became more than a shield against the cold. It became a world unto itself, a small rough-hewn kingdom cut out of the wilderness, where every log, every stone, every notch of wood spoke of your labor. Days bled into one another, marked not by calendars or clocks, but by the rhythm of survival. Wake at dawn, coax the fire to life, swing the axe until your arms screamed, set snares in the snow, check for tracks, eat whatever you could pull from the forest, then collapse into sleep beside the hearth. Outside, the mountains were locked in silence, snow so deep it swallowed trees, drifts that reshaped valleys, storms that swept through without warning. But inside, there was the heartbeat of fire, the low murmur of men's voices, the creak of timbers settling like an old body finding its rest. The work never ended. Firewood became a religion. You measured your life by the size of the pile against the cabin wall. Every log you split meant another night you would not freeze. Every armload dragged in through the door was another dawn you might wake to. Your hands hardened until blisters turned to callus, and even blood dried into the lines of your palms. Fitzgerald often muttered that a man's cabin was measured not by its walls, but by the wood stacked outside. By that measure, you were rich, though every stick had been bought with pain. Food was another matter. Rabbits came now and then to the snares, and once Cooper brought down a deer with his rifle. The meat hung high in the trees outside to freeze. In the bitter air, the taste of that venison roasted over pine coals was better than any feast you'd known back east. Still, hunger never left. Meals were lean, often nothing but thin stew stretched with scraps and melted snow. Each bite was chewed slow, savored not because it was fine, but because you knew how precious it was. Out here, every mouthful was borrowed time. Inside the cabin, order grew. The shelves lined with your tools and meager stores gave the place a sense of permanence. The sleeping platform, padded with pine boughs, renewed every few days, softened enough to keep the frost from your bones. The floor, once a patchwork of dirt and rough planks, grew familiar under your boots, scarred with axe cuts, stained with ash, but steady. The fireplace became a companion, its voice a constant crackling when the logs burned fast, murmuring low when coals settled deep. At night, when the wind screamed through the trees, you'd stare into those flames and feel them answer back. A reminder that you were still alive. There were nights when the silence pressed so close it seemed to smother you, when the howl of wolves in the distance reminded you how small your fortress truly was. In those hours, loneliness crept in, sharper than any cold. Fitzgerald would sometimes speak softly of his first years in the mountains, of friends buried in shallow graves, of cabins that never saw spring. Cooper rarely spoke, but when he did, it was to tell a blunt truth. Man don't last long thinking. On death, swing your axe, set your trap, keep moving. That's how you live. His words were hard, but they cut through the weight of silence better than any comfort could. They were survival made plain. Weeks turned into months. Snow piled. Higher storms came and went, and always the cabin endured. You patched leaks, you sealed cracks, you added bark to the roof when wind tore strips away. Every repair, every adjustment deepened the bond between you and the walls around you. This place was no longer just wood and stone. It was part of you, an extension of your will. Without it, you would be a body in the snow, nameless and lost. With it, you were a man with a chance, however slim, to see spring, and then one morning, long after you had stopped counting the days, you woke to a sound you hadn't heard in months. Dripping. Water ran from the eaves of the roof, thin streams, carving paths through the snowbanks outside the door. The air felt softer, the bite of frost dulled. When you stepped out, the world was changing. The sun was higher, the snow slumping under its warmth, the forest alive with the trickle of meltwater. Winter was breaking. You had endured. You looked back at the cabin and a fierce pride filled your chest. Against storms that would have buried you, against cold that would have stolen your breath, against hunger and loneliness and the endless weight of the wild, you had stood, not alone, not entirely Fitzgerald's steady hand, Cooper's brute strength, their knowledge and presence had been as vital as the logs themselves. But you had done the work. You had bent the wilderness, log by log, into something that held. And as the first true warmth of spring touched your face, you understood what those old mountain men must have felt, the ones whose journals you'd read by dim firelight. Survival wasn't glory, it wasn't triumph. It was stubbornness, grit, the refusal to lay down when the cold came whispering. It was building a home from nothing but axe steel, raw hands, and the will to see another dawn. The cabin stood behind you, blackened with smoke, patched and scarred, ugly by any civilized eye. To you, it was a palace, a monument not of stone or marble, but of endurance. The wilderness had tried to bury you, and yet here you were. A live asterisk. When the thaw came fully, the forest changed overnight. Snow that had swallowed valleys sank into rushing creeks, the hard crust breaking into rivers of mud. The air softened, filled with the calls of birds that had been silent all winter, their songs cutting sharp through the dripping silence. For the first time in months, you stepped out into a world of color-brown earth, green shoots pressing through the melt, the sky a gentler blue. The mountains hadn't vanished, their peaks still locked in ice, but the land below was stirring, awake. You stood before the cabin, the smoke curling from its chimney, and felt a weight you hadn't known was there slip from your shoulders. The roof was patched and scarred, the walls stained with smoke and mud, the door rough-hewn and crooked, but it had stood. Through storms that could have buried you, through nights of hunger and silence so deep it rattled the mind, it had held. Every scar on it was a mark of survival. Soon you would leave. There were pelts to trade, supplies to replenish, maybe a rendezvous down on the green river where the world of men would roar again with whiskey, gunfire, and laughter. You would walk away from this place, follow the rivers out, and the cabin would sit here alone, weathering the mountain winds. Maybe you'd come back next winter. Maybe some other wanderer, half frozen and desperate, would stumble across it and find shelter within these walls. It didn't matter. The cabin wasn't just yours anymore. It belonged to the wilderness, carved into it, a testament to the fact that a man had once stood here and refused to die. You ran your hand over the rough logs, feeling every notch, every splinter, every groove your axe had left. In another world, back east, they built houses with saws and hammers, glass and iron. Here, with nothing but steel, rawhide, and will, you had built something no less enduring. Civilization and wilderness weren't so far apart after all. They both began the same way. One man, one tool, one shelter against the dark dot. As you turned to leave, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scents of pine, thawing earth and wood smoke. For a moment, you looked back. The cabin stood small against the immensity of the mountains, a dot of human defiance in a sea of stone and forest. But in that dot was everything: warmth, endurance, the proof that a man could carve life from. Nothing. You smiled faintly, shouldered your rifle, and started down the trail. Behind you, the cabin held its ground, waiting for the next storm, the next season, the next man who dared to stand against the wilderness. It would remain long after your tracks melted into the earth, a silent monument to the spirit of those who came before and those who would come after. And as you walked away, the thought settled in your chest, like the steady burn of fire in the hearth. I built this with these hands, I endured, *.